You're listening to Learning is the New Working. It's a podcast series brought to you by the Learning Futures Group, and it looks at the future of learning for work and working for learning. This is an episode in our Season 5 called The Learning Leaders. In this series, we talk to influential leaders in the workplace learning industry, both practitioners, people who work in technology, related technology, and academic fields. But it's people who we think are breaking new ground, running radical experiments, and generally moving the discipline forward. Today's guest, I think, is certainly qualified. He is Simon Brown. He's the Chief Learning Officer at the Swiss pharma giant Novartis. He's an experienced corporate leader, and he's also the author of a book that's just been published called The Curious Advantage, which we'll definitely talk about during our conversation. Simon co-founded the UK's leading e-learning company called Brightwave. He worked at Accenture to consult for companies like British Telecom, BP, Microsoft, and Canon in the human capital space. And after a stint at Lloyds Bank, he moved to Novartis global headquarters in Switzerland in 2013. We have a great conversation where we talk about his journey in building a learning culture at Novartis and a little bit about his background and what he's learned in authoring a book on the topic of curiosity. So let's listen in to my conversation with Simon Brown. So, Simon, welcome to our podcast, which is called Learning is the New Working. Thanks for your time. I guess gritting your teeth through the pain of your recent bike accident. And
not at all. Glad to be here.
Could you start by telling us where in the world you live and work and why?
Yeah, I'm in Basel, Switzerland, and I came here 7 years ago when I took the job with Novartis.
Great. And what is your job title, and how would you describe the kind of work you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I'm our Chief Learning Officer, so I look after all things learning across our 108,000 people and 50,000 or so externals in 100 plus countries around the world.
Interesting. You should probably, I mean, it's kind of a household name, but you should probably just describe Novartis's focus and work.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a focused medicines company. Last year, we produced medicines that helped about 800 million people around the world.
And then your college and sort of formal studies, what, if anything, did you study at college?
Yeah, so I went to Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London in the UK, and studied management.
And what about sort of major points in your career? I know you've had some experience as an entrepreneur and you've worked in some other companies. What were your major career steps leading up to your current role?
Yeah, started as an accountant, quickly realised that wasn't the path that I wanted to tread, moved into using technology for learning, then set up a company called Brightwave in the UK, went from there to Accenture and ultimately leading their UK learning strategy team. And then after 7 or so years of doing that, I thought there was an opportunity to go client side and actually see if the advice that I'd been giving people actually worked. So spent scarily now nearly the last 10 years in roles within organisations, but learning's the constant for 20 plus years.
Can you give us some context of what's going on at Novartis? I know I met a lot of your team actually in at the beginning of the year at a conference in London and heard about what you guys had been up to. That's how I first came across it. But what are the sort of forces at work on Novartis and the pharmaceutical industry that sort of prompted you to rethink your model around corporate learning?
Yeah, so I guess the big trends that we're seeing are around overall scientific or biomedical innovation. We're seeing pressures around pricing as we get an aging workforce or aging population all around the world. And then we see through data and digital transformative forces there, as well as the medicines that we're producing becoming increasingly complex with things like cell and gene gene therapy as well. So considerable pressures there. And as a company, we're going into launching a range of new products over the next few years. So it's how do we get good at bringing those medicines to market so that the patients that need them can take advantage of them.
And what is the talent landscape? You said 108,000 people. What are the major job roles, and what are the sort of demographic trends within Novartis?
Yeah, so very diverse across the organisation. So whether it's in our what we call our technical operations team that does all the manufacturing of the products, whether it's in our research and development, so the deep science that comes up with the molecules, or our drug development business that then takes those through the clinical trial process to see what impact they have and the dosage and things, and then through to our sales force. So we have 20,000-30,000 people who go out and interact with healthcare practitioners around the world, and then all of the functions that support them, from IT and from finance and HR, etc. So very different workforces, and also in very different markets around the world as well. So it creates some challenges from a learning perspective of how you meet the different needs of a deep scientist who may be a world expert through to sort of someone new coming into the organization.
Yeah, really interesting. And I'd sort of forgotten when I was first talking to you about just you've pretty large sales population, and of course both the selling and marketing and development of drugs is so highly regulated. I suspect that must play a sort of big influence in how you think about doing readiness and training.
Definitely. We do over 1 million hours of what we call standard operating procedure training every year, that hugely regulated with all that comes with that. So very challenging and very different depending on the nature of training, whether it's leadership training through to that operating procedure training. Very different challenges.
I really want to make sort of a mental note for myself here that I want to come back and sometimes I think compliance training sort of can really conflict with the sort of culture work that I know you've been doing, and this sort of growth mindset work. If on the one hand you're sort of beating people with a stick to take their compliance training, and on the other hand you're trying to encourage curiosity, I wonder whether that you've experienced any sort of tension in that.
Yeah, I think we've made real progress over the last couple of years on our sort of global compliance training. So things like code of conduct, etc., where the teams have done a really good job of both making that very relevant and also working on a sort of adaptive learning. So if you demonstrate that you understand it, then there's no need to go through the things that you've demonstrated you understand, versus if you go through it and get things wrong, then it adapts to tailor it. So that sort of approach has been really effective, that I think has gone down well with people.
I want to go just back up a little bit to Novartis, if I can, for a moment, because I know that one of the things that I'm really interested in is organizations that have purpose statements, and helping people get well is a really sort of purpose-driven activity. And I was reading through the purpose statement, which says your purpose is to reimagine medicine and to improve and extend people's lives. But it made me think about the fact that this is a very historic company. I think it's over 100 years old, if I remember correctly. And yet,
yes.
This also at the very, very cutting edge of science and technology. And I wondered if this having a sort of purpose statement and a sense of purpose changes how you think about the work that you do, and how do you balance the sort of a rich historic culture with the need to be kind of on the cutting edge?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I would say before joining the company, which was now 7 years ago, I'd never really thought about purpose, I would say. But it's probably 2 years ago, we had I had an experience where some of the work that we were doing potentially was going to impact whether or not we could ship some of our medicine from one of our manufacturing sites. And that medicine was personalized medicine for children with cancer. And ultimately, therefore, if that medicine didn't ship, that was a life-saving medicine for someone's son or daughter. And ultimately, the decisions that we were making around learning were going to have an impact as to whether this medicine was able to get to the people that needed it. And in that situation, suddenly purpose really matters. And I think since then, I will look at purpose very differently around, what drives me and how I spend my time. And it's interesting that learning can have a very impactful, have a significant impact ultimately on patients' lives.
How is, just the nuts and bolts of things, how is L&D configured at Novartis? Your centralized function, and how do you think about it? How do you think about the mission and strategy of L&D within the overall sort of running and governance of the company?
Yeah, so overall, as a company, we have 5 pillars, 5 strategic pillars that we work to. The sort of number one priority with that is around unleashing the power of our people. Unleashing the power of our people is really around culture at its core, and we have a culture that we describe as curious, inspired, and unbossed. And so that curious element is really where learning comes in. So about 2 years ago, we worked on a revision to our learning strategy. Within that learning strategy, we sort of look at how do we overall create an environment where people are able to continuously learn? How do we make sure that the learning delivers business impact? And how do we make sure we organize ourselves in an efficient and effective way? Off the back of that, we've come up with really a single model now for learning. So certain elements that are centralized, certain elements that sit within the divisions, and we're working through on delivering against that strategy, which is really a 5+ year plan to get us to where we want to be.
Got it. And do you report into the HR function?
Yep. So my boss is the Chief People and Organisation Officer in one hand, and our shared services, people and organisation lead from another line.
One thing that when I heard from your team in London at the beginning of the year, they were sharing some of the work they were doing around this culture of curiosity. And it was super reminiscent of the work at Microsoft, which we sort of talked about as the shift from the know-it-all to the learn-it-all culture. This is hard work, right? I know from experience as being part of that effort that this is very hard work that takes a long time. And you need to sort of fire on all cylinders. I think the phrase is all oars have got to be in the water. You need leaders sort of pulling on this, as well as engaging people at the sort of grassroots level of the organization. What started that culture transformation journey at Novartis, and how did you what are the levers that you pulled to help build that culture? And I want to just add one thing. It's when I think about pharmaceutical companies, I think about them as sort of very academic and sort of scientific. And I would have thought there would have already been a really strong culture of curiosity there.
Yeah, so I guess where did it come about? So the culture change came about with our new CEO, Vas Narasimhan, who came in now about 2 years ago, and looked at culture as one of the levers really to realise the opportunity that we have within the company, that our culture had been holding us back in the past, and that if we can create a culture where people are curious, inspired, and unbossed, and that was influenced by Dan Pink's thinking around autonomy, purpose, and mastery, that will create an environment where people can be more authentic and we can be more successful. So probably also playing to your reference to Microsoft, so we did in fact visit Microsoft about 2 years ago as part of our sort of fact finding on how we implement the culture, and so we were heavily influenced by the work that was done there with Satya's culture change, and the be a learner, not a knower, it sort of came about from which is used often came about from the Microsoft influence. So I think that was where it all started. So yes, there was some degree of curiosity from the sense of sciences around discovery, but we also had a culture where we had a lot of experts, and there was an expectation around knowing the answer. and therefore there was an expectation that you would always know the answer, and that often resulted in things like having a 50-page PowerPoint deck, because somewhere in there you would be able to refer to the answer in there rather than coming out and sort of saying, no, actually, I don't know, and I'll go away and find it out. So we've been trying to create an environment where there's the psychological safety that actually is okay to not know the answer. It's okay to try things and for those things to fail, and we learn from them and we move on. So